Greetings and welcome to an LGR thing. And today's thing is the Hewlett-Packard iPac RX 1950 PDA, released in September of 2005 for an asking price of $299 US. More specifically though, this is a brand new in-box, still sealed example of the rather special model known as the RX 1955. Well, okay, calling it special is a bit of an exaggeration here. What I mean is that it holds special meaning to me, being that it was my first PDA, or personal digital assistant. The only real difference between the RX 1950 and 1955 is that the former was sold on a corporate market and the latter was sold at retail. And speaking of retail, PDAs were at the height of their popularity in the mid-2000s, and I'd had my mind set on getting one for years by 2005. This one stood out to me for several reasons back then, but let's get to some context first. I was 19 years old in 2005, just starting college, and found myself working odd jobs all over town. The main things I wanted to do were take notes, listen to MP3s, browse the web through Wi-Fi, and of course, I wanted to play some games while not smiling. Nowadays, it's easy enough to just grab a tablet or a smartphone and be done with it, but back then, nah man, tablets were way too expensive and cumbersome, and my cell phone was one of these beauties. An LG VX 6100. Not exactly a productivity powerhouse with its resolution of 96 by 64, but hey, it had a VGA camera, that was neat. So, with my needs in mind and the technology available, my two real options in 2005 were a laptop or a PDA. And while a laptop fit most of my needs, I didn't really have the money to get the ones I wanted, and the idea of hauling something that large to class in my already stuffed backpack was not appealing. So that led me to the iPac RX 1955, which at the time was one of HP's entry-level PDAs. They had a whole range of iPac devices back then, and to be honest, I found most of them pretty ugly. But not the RX 1955. Right on the front of the box you can see why I chose this model. Not only did it look sleek and stylish, but it had built-in Wi-Fi, ran Windows Mobile 5, and featured SDIO card expandability. These were three things I had almost no experience with at that point, and I was highly intrigued by the possibilities of being able to put my files and MP3s on an SD card and mess around with all that kind of stuff, but also with Windows Mobile and the whole Pocket PC ecosystem. And using Windows with a touchscreen was super appealing to me at the time. And hey, check out that Samsung logo on the box. What's that about? Well, the RX 1950 series made use of a 300 MHz Samsung SC32442, which was a 32-bit multi-stacked package based on the ARM 920T core that integrated a wide array of CPU, memory, and I/O functions into a single chip 14mm across. The result was that it may not have been the fastest chip of its day, but it was relatively cheap and drew little power. Enough technical details for the moment, it's time to break that seal after it's languished in some overstocked warehouse for 13 years. Oh yeah, this is exciting. I sold off my original RX 1955 forever ago, so I haven't seen this stuff in ages. Atop the first layer of packaging is the documentation shrink-wrapped for your protection, as well as this informative quick start guide on the underside of the box lid, and an equally informative but less necessary section on the front advertising several of the optional accessories you could buy from HP. And on the second layer down, you get a neat little tray holding the iPac itself, and man, does holding this again immediately bring back memories. Although it seems a bit smaller than I remember somehow, but actually that's probably just because I'm used to using gargantuan 7-inch smartphones these days. Next, you get the USB sync and charging cable, the power adapter, the battery, and a simple fabric carrying case. Let's go ahead and open up that documentation bundle before going further though, starting with the manual that looks more substantial than it really is. There are only about 45 pages of it per language, and most of what it contains can be learned just by using the device and its built-in tutorials. You also receive a Getting Started CD, which contains the software to sync it with a Windows PC and all that kind of stuff. You also get another ad for more HP products and accessories, including some lovely-looking leather cases that I still kind of want, as well as some information on warranties and end-user license agreements that I, of course, absolutely read cover to cover. And hey look, another ad, this one for Audible.com. Not sponsored. Man, they just have not let off the gas, have they? And yes, that free month still applies, but only because they've never stopped giving away free months to anything that moves. And hey look, yet another ad, this time for Smartphone and Pocket PC Magazine. Yeah, they must have just rebranded it when they printed this. I remember when it was just called Pocket PC Magazine for a while. Well, enough of that, time for some plastic peeling perfection. Ah, that feels right. And because I can't wait to play with this again, let's just plug in the battery and see if it works. It does, although it'll certainly need some charging. Still though, the battery held enough juice all this time to get through the initial setup stuff like calibrating the touchscreen and setting the time of day. Sweet. So to get this thing charged up using the wall adapter, we'll need both that and the ActiveSync cable because there's nowhere to plug this in directly from the wall to the iPack. That goes in the bottom there, and then this whole thing plugs into the PDA. You can also charge it directly through USB with a newer third-party cable, but from the factory you did need both cables combined to get power. This was pretty normal for PDAs like this. On the top from left to right you get a 3.5mm headphone jack, a spot to plug in SD or MMC cards, and a spot to store your stylus, which is pretty necessary. This doesn't have a capacitive touchscreen you will be pressing down to get things to work. And I always kind of liked how it has this fake SD card, I guess to keep the slot from getting dirt and crap in there, and instead of putting a little protector on top, they were just like, here's a blank piece of plastic to put in there. So turning it on is as simple as pressing the on button, and you get these two LEDs up at the top. The left one is the Wi-Fi indicator, and the right one shows if it's charging or needs charging. And along the bottom you get some physical buttons. Mostly they're for shortcuts to applications, but by default holding down this one actually changes the screen orientation from portrait to landscape mode, a handy little thing indeed since this doesn't have any accelerometers or anything to do that automatically. Along the right hand side here you'll see this little silver switch, which is for opening the battery bay. That's really all that does. And on the left hand side you'll see this little cassette tape symbol beside this button here, and pressing that immediately opens up the voice recording mode. And yes, this does have a microphone built in. This is a direct recording from the iPack. Not the greatest microphone I've ever heard, but not the worst either. Along the bottom is where you plug in your ActiveSync cable, and you also get this little port here for IRDA. This is the infrared interface, so if you had any software that, say, acted as a virtual remote control, you can actually control your TV, your AV receiver, anything with infrared that can be programmed, and you could use your PDA as a smart remote, which was pretty awesome in 2005. Okay, so let's dive into the interface and really the Windows Mobile Pocket PC experience for a bit, because this is not only something that intrigued me a whole lot in the early 2000s, but it really kind of still does. I enjoy seeing Windows crammed into a smaller environment like this and comparing it to the desktop experience. I mean, you still get a start menu, you still have a control panel full of all the settings that you would expect. In fact, some things that you might not expect, depending on your expectations, like the ability to remap every single one of the buttons on this thing, except for the power button, of course. So if you want to swap anything to pretty much anything else, yeah, you can do that. You can make a dedicated solitaire button if you want to. It doesn't matter. It lets you do it. This is also where you can apply all sorts of battery saving options, brightness settings, things like that. Although, due to the hardware that this uses, like I mentioned earlier, the battery life is really good. At least on a fresh battery back in the day, you could get over 9, even up to 10 hours of battery life, depending on what you're doing. In my experience, this older battery, it only holds about 3 or 4 hours, but still not terrible, considering this is a 1100 milliamp hour battery from 2005. Something that is not so cool though about the RX 1955 is the memory situation. It came with a 64 megabyte ROM as well as 32 megs of SD RAM. But yeah, it doesn't leave you with a whole lot, so having a half-decent SD card in there is absolutely a requirement as far as I'm concerned. And again, if you're familiar with the Windows environment and navigating all that kind of stuff, then the File Explorer acts very much like Windows Explorer. And you have plenty of familiar folders like My Documents, Program Files, Temp, and Windows, and any SD or MMC cards that you insert will show up as a folder in here. As for all the applications that came on the 1955, it's pretty much your generic PDA type stuff. You get a calendar for doing calendar scheduling things. You get a contacts list for adding contacts to your list, mostly for email because this is not a smartphone. You can't call anyone or text anyone, but if you wanted to communicate in some way, either directly to another iPack or over the internet, you can do that. You also get a calculator for doing very specific calculations. And then you have Pocket MSN. And I actually did use this back in the day for a little bit because I had Hotmail at one point. You also get a notes app where you can handwrite in your own notes here, and yes, it does have handwriting recognition, which actually was pretty accurate. I was always impressed with how well that it handled my sloppy handwriting. This version of Windows Mobile 5 also came with some pretty basic Microsoft Office suite programs, such as PowerPoint Mobile, which doesn't actually let you create PowerPoints, but if you had any that you put on your SD card, then you could view them. And you also got Word Mobile, which is an incredibly simple word processor, and that was fine, although typing on this little tiny screen is just not something you wanted to do, especially in my case. I was at school, I wanted to use this thing for taking notes in class, and I did, but usually I would just write it in the Notes app, or what I did is actually got one of those fold-out keyboards. I don't have that anymore, but it would plug in the ActiveSync thing and kind of created a little cradle situation. But yeah, don't expect a whole lot in terms of customization or formatting of your documents. You get a grand total of 2 fonts, Tahoma or Courier New, that's it. No word art here, but hey, no Clippy either, so you take your wins where you can get them. Even more limited, though, is Excel Mobile. I can't imagine anyone ever did any kind of serious work with spreadsheets on this little screen. I would hate to actually make a substantial spreadsheet on this. It's okay for doing edits to existing ones, I suppose. Now let's get to some of the more enjoyable, fun applications like Windows Media Player, which of course lets you play media like MP3s and WMA files. That was a huge reason that I wanted a PDA. I never had an iPod, I've still never had an iPod. So I was always interested in devices like this that let me do all sorts of things in addition to playing MP3s. And you could also view and do some very basic image manipulation with photographs. Stuff like rotating and cropping, and that's about it. And yes, there actually was a camera add-on for this device, which I never had. I would still like to get one just to try it out, but yeah, it was pretty neat to be able to take photos around with you like this, especially with digital cameras back then. I mean, my HP digital camera had a 1-inch display in 2005, so this one being almost 4 inches was pretty awesome. It also made it pretty great for watching back video files in the Windows Media Video format.
Greetings and welcome to an LGR thing, and this thing right here is the Tapwave Zodiac.
The speaker is not particularly great, but it was pretty cool with headphones. And you know, it's a 320 by 240 resolution screen. That's not a massive amount or anything, but it doesn't really need it. This is a 3.7-inch diagonal screen, and it's in 16-bit color. The pixel density is really not that bad. I definitely watched a few episodes of Prison Break on this back in the day. And then finally there's the wireless capability of this thing, which comes in the form of built-in Wi-Fi. And no, this does not have Bluetooth, which a lot of reviewers dinged this device for back in the day, but I didn't really care about Bluetooth. Wi-Fi was all I cared about, and this iPack came with 802.11b support built in. Still totally usable depending on the network you're trying to connect to, but I've found that there are quite a few places and devices that no longer broadcast an 802.11b signal and stick to G or N. But an even bigger issue can be the wireless encryption, and more often than not, this is a real roadblock, seeing as this device predates WPA2 being mandatory. Doesn't seem to support it at all, so you'll have to find something with WPA, WEP, or just no encryption at all. And you can probably get around that issue at home with your own router, but connecting to public Wi-Fi in coffee shops or random businesses is a real toss-up. Most spots I tried don't have the right signal, don't use a supported encryption method, or they require a login webpage that the iPack didn't know what to do with, treating what should be clickable buttons as text, or not loading at all. Sometimes even crashing the program. Heck, it'll do that when you're just trying to load any number of modern websites. The browser in general is just too outdated to be very usable. It won't even load Google or anything with HTTPS. And really, this browser sucked in 2005 as well, which is why I ended up installing Opera for Pocket PCs even back then. Oh well, that's enough of that. Let's move on to the gaming side of things, starting with the two rather lackluster games it comes pre-installed with. The first one being Microsoft Solitaire, which is just Solitaire, and Bubble Breaker, which is one of these things where you just kind of try to pop as many objects together as you can. As long as there are two or more connected, then you can pop them, and that's it. Incredibly basic games that does not do this device justice whatsoever, because really, the RX 1955 and all sorts of Pocket PCs from the mid-2000s are quite capable gaming machines. And of course, getting games on there often meant that you had to plug it into a PC and get it going that way. This is the CD that it came with, installing under Windows XP, and once that gets going, ActiveSync will do its thing and sync any of your information on your PC that you tell it to, or you can use it as an interface between your iPac and any downloaded programs that you want to install onto the machine. Or if you don't want to do it that way, or if your program, say, came in a CAB file, which a lot of homebrew and more illegitimate packages do, then you can just open up the Pocket PC right in Windows Explorer and then just copy and paste the CAB files. And then open them directly from the iPac, and there you go. It's not going to ask for much of any verification. It might say, oh, unknown publisher, but there's nothing stopping you from installing pretty much anything you want on this thing. So yeah, let's just check out a few of the games that I bought or demoed back in the day, starting with the official port of SimCity 2000. I actually bought this physically. I believe it was a Best Buy or something. They had a whole section of Pocket PC games and software that you could buy boxed for a few years. And yeah, this one in particular, SimCity 2000, is pretty good. That pixel art looks fantastic on this little tiny screen, and you know what? It plays pretty well. Probably runs it better than my 66 MHz 486 did back in the day, really. I was also really fond of a lot of the Astroware games, in particular the ones from PopCap, before they became microtransaction-laden free-to-play garbage. Games like Bejeweled 2 were pretty great because it was really just the same game as you would get on a desktop PC, but in a handheld format, and that was so cool, at least for the time. And I really liked playing it with the stylus. In fact, pretty much any game that was meant to be played with a mouse pointer is great with a stylus, if not better sometimes, because you get really direct control, such as with PopCap's and Astroware's version of Zuma. In fact, the control is so precise that it almost makes the gameplay trivial. You just point and tap to wherever you want your balls to go. So yeah, I ended up spending a lot of time downloading and trying out all of the Astroware games. And then there were independent, freely released homebrew games like Wolfenstein 3D here. This one just comes with the shareware version, but you can install the full one as well if you had the files to go with it. And yeah, it's a pretty darned accurate port of Wolfenstein. It's really only held back by the control scheme here, and that only makes sense. That little directional pad on the bottom of the unit is just not made for moving around in games. For one thing, it has a button in the middle of it, so if you try to rock it around with your finger, you end up pressing the button, which activates something else, and it just doesn't feel good at all anyway. And since you don't have any buttons on the other side of the unit, either on the top or the right in this case, you have to tap on the screen to do things like fire and open doors, and it's kinda novel, and it friggin' works, but that's about it. You'd really want to plug in a keyboard if you were going to play these games for any length of time. And the same goes for emulators, of which, yes, there were a ton for Windows Mobile and Pocket PCs, and they were pretty capable due to the hardware. This one right here is Pocket Nester, which allows you to play NES and Famicom games, and you know what? It does a pretty good job. Again, the problem is the control scheme. These buttons are just not made for gaming. Again, it's not like a modern phone. It's not a capacitive touchscreen. You don't get multi-touch at all, so it just doesn't make sense for any kind of virtual key or controller layout. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the iPac RX 1955, a machine that I am very fond of at this point, but you know what? Back in 2006, or really I guess 2007, well, let's just say the honeymoon period didn't last very long. I think I had this thing for about 6-7 months, and then I was like, nah man, I sold it off and bought myself a BlackBerry Pearl. Because honestly, the screen was just too small to do any kind of serious work in class or anywhere for that matter. I ended up just taking notes on paper and then using a BlackBerry for things like MP3s and keeping a calendar and contacts list and doing Wi-Fi and all that. And besides, it had a data plan and I could just use mobile internet through, I guess it was Suncom at that point, and then they moved on to T-Mobile. But anyway, the BlackBerry did really most of what I wanted on the iPac other than the games. And for the games, I ended up buying myself a PSP 2000. And that just satisfied me for a long time as far as doing portable gaming with physical controls and a lot of support for homebrew software. Like, it's so easy to soft mod one of those things. And yeah, with a BlackBerry and a PSP, that just didn't make sense to hold on to the iPac for very long. But it is still something that I absolutely have had a blast going back to mess with now, which brought a very healthy dose of happy nostalgia in equal parts with a healthy dose of reality and why I got rid of it in the first place. Still though, it's kind of reignited my passion for pocket PCs, and now I'm looking at some of the others back then that would have been even better options, and I'm sure I'll be revisiting these kind of mid-2000s mobile devices in the future, so if you enjoyed this video, I definitely recommend sticking around. I have another couple in the works already. One is from Palm, and one is from Sweden. Let's put it that way. But anyway, enough of this ramble for this video, and I thank you very much for watching.